Do you believe in ghosts? What if you actually met one? Most people would be so scared they couldn't even think straight. That's what happened to the people in the stories we're about to tell you. These 5 true ghost stories are so strange and scary, they're hard to explain. They've left everyone who's heard them feeling a bit spooked. So, let's dive in and start with the very first true story. Terrifying Story 1. This spooky story comes from a 16-year-old guy. He was on the road late at night with his mom and older sister. Despite the late hour, they were all still wide awake. They were in need of a gas refill and a bathroom break, so they decided to stop at the only rest area they had seen for miles. Right when they pulled up, something didn't feel right. They'd been making plenty of stops on their road trip, but none had ever given off the eerie vibe this one did. His mom and sister headed straight inside while he stayed behind in the car. That's when he noticed a group of teenagers at a van, quickly deciding to leave because they felt something was off. There was also a small gray car with 2 guys just standing by it, not moving at all, almost like they were frozen in time. Things got even weirder when his mom and sister ran back to the car looking scared. The 2 men by the gray car slowly turned their heads to look at them, their eyes dark and empty like voids. They drove away as fast as they could, not stopping until they were well into the next city. The creepiest part of all, when they tried to find the rest stop again on a map, it was as if it had never existed. They even asked locals about it, but no one had any idea what they were talking about. It was like the rest stop was a ghost, appearing only to them that one night. Terrifying Story 2. This story is from a group of friends who decided to have a bit of an adventure one night. They were driving around in a very old car, just exploring, when they thought it would be interesting to visit a huge graveyard. It was kind of a spooky idea, but they were all up for it. They drove in, parked the car, and started walking around. Pretty soon, they came across this small pond that had a really eerie feel to it. On the other side of the pond, they spotted a figure. It was all dressed in black and had an old-fashioned top hat on. It was so still and quiet, just sitting there on the rock. The friends thought it was a bit weird, but decided to wave and shout hi to see if they could get a reaction. But the figure didn't move or acknowledge them at all. It just sat there, which made them feel a bit uneasy. Suddenly, without any warning, the figure stood up and started running right across the water towards them. But here's the scary part. Halfway across the pond, it just vanished. Like, completely disappeared into thin air. That freaked them out big time. They all screamed and ran back to the car, hoping to get out of there as fast as possible. But when they tried to start the car, it wouldn't work. That's when they started to hear these banging noises coming from the back of the car. It wasn't constant, just every few seconds, like someone or something was hitting the car. They looked outside, but it was too dark to see anything. Feeling more scared by the minute, they tried to call for help, but none of their phones had any signal. They were completely cut off. They kept trying to start the car, feeling more and more panicked. The air felt heavy and thick, almost like it was hard to breathe. They didn't hear the banging anymore, but the scary feeling didn't go away. After what felt like forever, the car finally started. They didn't waste a second and drove out of there as fast as they could. As soon as they left the graveyard, their phones all came back to life, and they could finally call for help. Looking back, they all agree that something very strange and frightening happened to them in that graveyard. It wasn't just their imagination. Something was there with them, something that wasn't supposed to be in the world of the living. They haven't been back to that graveyard since, and probably never will. It was a night they'll never forget. Terrifying Story 3. This spooky story comes from a Reddit user who had a ghostly encounter while camping. She and her husband, along with his family, were out at a small remote lake in New Mexico. There were about 10 of them, and nearby another group of 6 people were camping too. It was night, and both groups were just hanging out, enjoying s'mores, a few drinks, and sharing stories. That's when things got weird. Out of nowhere, they all heard what sounded like a little girl yelling for help. The thing is, neither group had any kids with them, but they were sure they were hearing a little girl's voice. So, they decided to team up and check out where the sounds were coming from. Behind their campsites, there was a field. And there, standing about 100 feet away, was this really tall, pure white figure. Everyone agreed it looked about 6 feet tall, really skinny, and completely white. They tried to get closer to figure out what it was, but the more they moved towards it, the more it backed away, eventually disappearing into the trees. And all night, they kept hearing the little girl's cries for help, trying to sleep through the haunting sounds. Terrifying Story 4. This chilling story is from a nurse who worked at a place for people with mental health issues. They met a really tall guy there, almost 7 feet, who didn't talk at all. This guy, Marion, used to talk just fine and lived a normal life before he suddenly disappeared one night after joining the military. Everyone thought he was gone for good, even said he was dead. Then, out of nowhere, 10 years later, Marion shows up at the hospital saying, "I've been dead for 10 years." And then he never spoke another word again. He was all dusty and still wearing the same clothes from when he'd vanished. Nobody had heard from him. No ID, nothing. But they figured out it was him by checking his fingerprints. His family didn't want anything to do with him, saying they'd already said their goodbyes. Marion would just walk around all day, sometimes moving his lips like he was trying to talk or laugh, but no sound came out. He seemed to listen if you talked to him, and would do this silent laugh thing, throwing his head back but making no noise. They tried giving him medicine, but nothing changed. He wouldn't do anything in therapy either, just smiled and went back to walking around if you didn't keep him sitting down. On the nurse's last day, the last thing they saw was Marion walking around the parking lot, doing his silent laugh. That made the nurse wonder if Marion was actually a ghost. And then again, he vanished while all doors were closed. Even now, they still can't figure out what was really going on with him. Terrifying Story 5. This story is from a 37-year-old who went back to their hometown for a high school reunion. After landing at the nearest airport and renting a car, they had to drive about 35 miles through a pretty empty and quiet part of the country to get to town. Just a few miles outside the town, they spotted someone on the side of the road trying to catch their attention. It turned out to be Jim, an old school friend. Jim looked pretty much the same, just a bit older, despite it being 20 years since they last saw each other. They caught up as they drove into town, and when they got there, the person offered to take Jim for a drink at the reunion. But Jim just wanted to be dropped off at home. He used to live near the person's grandmother's house, but this time, he asked to be taken to the outskirts of town, towards a mobile home park. When they got to the turnoff, Jim got out of his car and said it was great seeing them again, and disappeared into the night. Later at the reunion, while catching up with old classmates and talking about who was coming to the reunion, the person mentioned picking up Jim and dropping him off. Suddenly, the room went silent. My cousin turned as white as a sheet. They told me, "Jim died in a car accident on that curve 8 years ago. We all went to his funeral." Hearing this made the person feel dizzy, so they stepped outside for some air. Back in the car, they found a local newspaper from 8 years ago. With Jim's obituary in it, they've kept that paper ever since. And that was the 5 terrifying true stories of ghostly encounters that defy explanation. Tell us in the comments section which story you find more fascinating. Thank you for watching, and best of luck.